I got my handy dandy YouTube journal right here to read you off the questions and whatnot. So yeah. Hi friends, it's Kay. Welcome back to my channel. And today I am bringing you a book tag after what has felt like forever since I've done a book tag. So I'm super excited to be bringing this one to you. So today's book tag is called Get to Know the Fantasy Reader, and I saw this on Book Blog Browsing's channel. I will link that video down below because that is what introduced me to this tag. And I'll also link the Book Pusher, who is the original tag creator, as well in the description box. And yes, I love fantasy books, so I'm super excited to get to tell you guys why I love fantasy books and what got me into fantasy and all that fun stuff. So let's jump right into it. What is your fantasy origin story, aka the first fantasy book you read that got you into fantasy? And honestly, I struggled with this because I don't think I read a true fantasy world transporting book until early high school, so I was already into fantasy by then. And I debated if whether Percy Jackson was the first fantasy book I read, because technically it's fantasy even though it's mainly mythology and urban. But I decided not to count Percy Jackson and the Olympians, even though that is kind of what got me into the fantastical elements of books. But the first fantasy book I read was actually urban fantasy, and that was Cassandra Clare in the Shadowhunter series, The Mortal Instruments to be precise. Even though Mortal Instruments is like my least favorite of all the Shadowhunter books, I owe it to them for getting me into urban fantasy. So yes, round of applause. Thank you, City of Bones. And honestly, I liked City of Bones, and then I liked City of Heavenly Fire, but the in-between, I was just like, somehow still reading. But you know what? It's fine. I know people love the Mortal Instruments, and I owe it to them for getting me into the Shadowhunter world, as well as urban fantasy and fantasy in general. So thank you to that. Thank you, Cassie Clare. The second question is, if you were the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be your author and what trope would you insist be in it? I love that question. Oh my gosh, so much fun. For some reason, whenever I am picturing myself in a fantasy novel, I'm either royalty or I don't know. I just love the idea of being a royal in a fantasy realm. It sounds so much fun, and yeah, that's what I go with. Who's gonna stop me? And I think the author I would want to write my fantasy novel would have to be Rosamund Hodge. She's kind of a dark fantasy, but she's a fairy tale retelling master in a fantasy realm. She wrote Cruel Beauty and Crimson Bound, and she's going to be writing What Monstrous Gods, which is coming out in 2022, and I would be honored because her writing is just so beautiful, and the fantasy realms she creates are so mesmerizing, and I just love it. I'd love for her to write it, and knowing her, it'd be a fairy tale retelling, so yes. And the trope I'd have to insist on would be childhood friends to lovers, because somehow in a fantasy book that just hits different. That's already my favorite romance trope, but in a fantasy realm, it's just mwah, chef's kiss. And bonus points if that is bodyguard royalty trope, because honestly, the only book I can think of that just comes to mind is Winter by Marissa Meyer with Justin and Winter. That's what made the trope so amazing to me. And yeah, I'm always looking for bodyguard royalty tropes, so let me know if you have any, especially if it's fantasy. So yes, long story short to that answer, Rosamund Hodge writing me a childhood friends to lovers fantasy novel. Yes, love that, please. Question number 3 is a fantasy you have read this year that you want other people to read. And technically, I've only read one fantasy novel this year in 2021, and that was Addie LaRue, and the whole world's read Addie LaRue. And besides, that was very slight fantasy. It's more historical fiction. So I'm jumping back to 2020, and the 2 books I read there were The Shadows Between Us and Blood and Honey, and both these books have very mixed reviews. But yeah, those are the only pure fantasy books I read, and I love them both. Shadows Between Us was number 8 on my top 10 of 2020, so I loved it despite what other people think. But yeah, those were both a lot of fun. The Shadows Between Us was pitched as a Slytherin romance, and we follow very ambitious Alessandra as she tries to marry the Shadow King in order to kill him on her wedding night and take over his kingdom as queen and ruler. But along the way, as other people try to kill him, she ends up finding herself protecting him as well as falling for him. And I loved that book. It was fast-paced, it was so immersive, and I loved it. And then Blood and Honey is, of course, the sequel to Serpent and Dove. And people thought it was kind of a plot filler book, but honestly, that book had so much plot and we developed so quickly, and I loved it more than Serpent and Dove. So if you didn't like Serpent and Dove, I do recommend continuing with Blood and Honey. To me, that book was so much better. There's found family, it's just a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. So while we're here, I just realized I forgot to show you guys The Shadows Between Us, and I climbed on my ladder to my bookshelf to get it. So I'm showing it now because I don't want to have wasted that climb. So yes, this is Shadows Between Us. I recommend it. Go pick it up if you like dark fantasy romance, and yeah. Number 4, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what fantasy subgenre have you not read much of? That, for me, is definitely urban fantasy. I love urban fantasy because I love the light sprinkling of something fantastical in our modern, mundane world. And then I have not read any epic fantasy, I don't think. Like, I don't have the brain power to follow along the slow building, world building of epic fantasy. And yeah, one day I'll get there, but not yet. I'm sticking to young adult fantasy that, yeah, it's what I do. It's fine. I love my urban fantasy. Number 5 is who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors, and that is Rosamund Hodge. I think she's only officially published 2 novels. I know she's written a bunch of short stories, but novel-wise, I own both Crimson Bound and Cruel Beauty, and I really highly enjoyed / loved them both, and I can't wait for her next book. And I'm also going to put Leigh Bardugo because even though King of Scars wasn't my favorite, I'm still picking up Rule of Wolves, and I just love the Grishaverse. I love being in that world, so I'm always going to pick up a Leigh Bardugo Grishaverse book, so yeah. Number 6, how do you typically find fantasy recs? And to that, definitely BookTube and Bookstagram. I actually find, I think, more fantasy recs on Bookstagram because a lot of people post about the arcs and the different books they got that I would not typically find here on BookTube, and that's awesome. I love that Bookstagram gives me more insight on different books to buy. So yes, I do like going through Bookstagram to find fantasy recs because a summary and then a pretty picture of the cover is side by side, and it's great. It's how I find a lot of book recommendations, actually. Number 7, what is an upcoming fantasy release you are super excited for? And I mentioned this in my anticipated releases video, which should have been up by now, and that is Secrets of the Star-Crossed. And this is about what if the Roman Empire never fell, and there's Celtic mythology and magic, and it just sounds so awesome and cool, and it's coming out late January, so I cannot wait for it. Number 8, what is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? And this is more about being a fantasy reader and what qualifies as fantasy, and that is you do not have to read epic fantasy to consider yourself a fantasy reader. There's so many subgenres such as urban fantasy and paranormal and all that other amazing stuff, and if you enjoy that more than epic fantasy, you are still a fantasy reader. Read the fantasy you like, and yeah, because I don't read epic fantasy, and sometimes I feel kind of bad about that, but then I remember I'm still a fantasy reader because I like just a different type of fantasy. Number 9, if someone who has never read fantasy before came up to you and asked for 3 books to get them started in the genre, what would you recommend? I really like this question because I love recommending books, and this is such a cool idea of how to recommend. So my first, if to get you started on fantasy, I would recommend these books in order. The first being what got me into fantasy, City of Bones. And this is because this is urban fantasy, and Cassandra Clare's writing, even though she's introducing you to a whole new world, a whole new vocabulary, I think her writing is so immersive and almost easy to read. After all, I know everyone can fly through a Cassandra Clare book typically. Even Queen of Air and Darkness, which was literally almost 1,000 pages, and I know I read it in like 2 days because her writing is just immersive and fast-paced and easy to read. But so I highly do recommend starting this because it's urban fantasy. You learn how to connect the world building as well as learning the new vocabulary, and I feel like it's very easy to get into with the characters, even though they're not my favorite, but whatever. But yes, I do recommend your first fantasy introduction to be City of Bones, followed by Cruel Beauty, because as we all know, the Shadowhunters universe is unbelievably big, and as a new fantasy reader, you would then want to probably go into a classic fantasy in which there's only a standalone. So Cruel Beauty, honestly, as a standalone, is an easy world to immerse yourself into with not much to learn. The magic system's pretty simple to learn, and the world building is pretty simple to learn as well. So I do recommend Cruel Beauty as an easy get into it fantasy because it's immersive, it's quick and easy to learn, and the story is so amazing. Plus, it's a standalone. So once you finished it, you did it. You have read a fantasy book. Followed up last by the Folklore trilogy because, again, this is a super easy world to learn. The magic and all the fairy stuff is easy to learn, and it's a trilogy, which means you can continue your knowledge but not go forever, if you know what I mean. And I cannot believe I'm recommending the Folklore on my channel because, while I do love it and Jude is my actual queen, it's definitely not my favorite, but I do believe it's a great introduction to fantasy because, again, the magic system's pretty easy to learn, the world building is pretty easy to learn, and there is an element of urban fantasy because even though we're in a different world, we still have parts of our own world, and Jude, being mortal, has those elements to her as well, which makes her an easy character to follow, as well as just because she's intriguing and powerful and ambitious, and she's so much fun to follow. So those are my fantasy recommendations in order in case you want to try to get into fantasy. And yes, those are all young adult because I am still trying to trek into adult fantasy. And if you have any recommendations on adult fantasy to get into first, let me know in the comments. And last but not least, number 10, who is your most recent fantasy reader, content creator you would like to shout out? Now, personally, I don't have any new recents that I know of because I tend to stick to the same people over and over again. But the two fantasy reader content creators I would love to shout out because they have given me so many recs is Rue from Rue's Reading Corner. She loves fantasy and has so many great recommendations, both young adult and adults, that I have on my TBR now that I can't wait to get into. So yes, there's Rue, and then there's also Ashley from A Frolic in Fiction. She is my mythology fantasy go-to recommendation queen. I love seeing her videos because she always has a new book to recommend, and I have so many fantasies on my TBR because of her. So yes, if you want mythology and fantasy and the folklore, go check her out. And that is it. I forgot how much I love doing book tags. So if you ever have a book tag, please tag me. I'd love to participate. So yes, oh crap, I have to tag people. Alright, I'm going with my go-to tag people, and that is going to be Jamie from Library Says, Anzu from Read of Anzu, and anyone else who would love to give this a try and are a fantasy reader. I'd love to know your answers. And if you want to see more of me, my social medias are linked below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Kay. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!